Welcome to the Brazilian Magic and Sorcery channel.
On this video, we will see a brief
Analysis of the history of Brazilian magic and religions,
and within this analysis, we will see the development of the most famous
theologies and their variations of Brazilian religions. As we saw in the video about Luzia,
there were officially hunter-gatherers in Brazil approximately 20–12,000 years ago. The Sambaquis structures reveal more complex rituals linked to funerary rites at least 8,000 years ago, and around 5,000 years ago, the domestication of the Amazon rainforest began to occur.
From this point onwards, groups of native peoples began to organize,
who will govern the territory until the 16th century, when the arrival of Europeans. So for 11,500 years, Brazilian religious structure is basically native,
evolving from hunter-gatherer shamanism to Pagellina,
which still exists and which is also the basis of many current theologies. What do we know about these practices? The basic structure of the natives, especially from the Amazon,
has a cult of nature beings, the enchanted ones, and ancestors,
in addition to the application of medicines, uses of herbs, use of tobacco as a sacred leaf in rituals for contact with ancestors, use of sacred drinks based on roots and bark,
use of maracas to call ancestors or wake up the enchanted. There is the emergence of theologies generally validating
cultural traits of different native peoples. Thus, there are the descendants of jaguars, thunder, snakes, river navigators.
They will be studied with specifications soon,
and with this,
different techniques and technologies that guarantee the
cultural individuality of certain groups, such as the Marajura ceramics and fishing technique, which is the most well-known landmark.
But it is important to understand that at this point, the idea of deities begins to emerge.
Like the famous Tupi deities,
Tuptupan, god of thunder and justice and creator,
Korasi Garasi, the god of the sun,
Yesi Jesi, the goddess of the moon, Yarai, goddess of the waters,
which I believe all Brazilians should know even if it's just the name. These deities are included in some later theologies,
or associated with African deities in some others.
The classic division of the tripartite world into land, sky and sea has indigenous origins, and although not mentioned openly, the chthonic world inside the earth,
it is the basis of many Umbanda altars, although today not much is said about it.
The statue of the water goddess Yemen Yema for North Americans, who is a river deity in Nigeria in origin.
In Brazil, she assumed the position of goddess of the sea and waters,
and on the altar the native goddess Janana was placed and was praised.
And many chants use both names to refer to the deity as a single deity.
In the 16th century, Europeans arrived, and with them, at first, the arrival of Catholicism as its official religion.
From this union, still in the 16th century,
the first mixed religion of Catholicism and native beliefs emerged, called sanctity, where ancestral spirits were invoked
in a ritualistic structure similar to a mass.
In the 16th century, Sephardic Jews also arrived, which in northeastern Brazil will give rise to some specific cults of King Solomon.
There is even a native tradition that says that
King Solomon himself had been in Brazil. Possibly this belief arises based on this influence,
which is also alive today in Katim.
Also, in the 16th century, the first Africans arrived from Costa da Mina,
that is, the people we call Ufon,
but which are various peoples from the Dahomey region. They bring with them the beliefs and practices that are today called Candomblé JJ, which is linked to the belief in Vodans.
From the beliefs of Costa da Mina with the beliefs of the Amazon natives, religions such as Taba de Mina emerge.
European exiles also arrive in Brazil. This is the expelled from Portugal to help build the colony.
These were not criminals as some interpret, but rather it was a light penalty,
widely applied to those who did not adapt to the strict Catholic regime in Portugal. Not going to Mass was a crime whose penalty could be exile to Brazil.
And this is where European sorcerers and witches arrive.
Iberian practices such as boiling spells, the magic of grimoires,
the fear of the famous book by Saint Cyprian begins,
which to this day is feared in Brazil by some and desired by others.
Honestly, this book deserves a video just about it.
Not because it is in fact a grimoire, but because it was very influential in the popular imagination.
New Christians also arrive, that is, recently converted Catholics.
This group includes some of Jewish, Islamic and Gypsy origins. These groups will also mix religiously with African and native groups,
to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the region,
forming different types of cults. In the 17th century, Bantu Africans arrived from Congo-Angola regions, from the most of the entities that present themselves in the line
of Umbanda black elders come from,
including the very name that Brazilian religions usually used to talk about the spiritual plane that would be a kind of paradise. It is a Ruanda that refers to the Luanda or from Luanda, which makes us understand that the idea of returning to Luanda, it would be the same idea as going to paradise. Something similar happened in Haiti, where the spiritual plane also makes reference to African origin. Guinea, also in the 17th century,
the Dutch invasion occurred in northeastern Brazil, and although there is nothing confirmed about religious influence in Brazil, it is known that the Dutch had Nordic beliefs in their religious past, and some myths seem to suffer a little from this influence, even if slightly.
The 17th century is also marked by the influence of the Jesuits in the
catechization of natives.
Furthermore, the Iberian Union occurred during this period, a period in which Portugal and Spain had a single king, Dom Philip II. In this time, the Portuguese and Spanish colonies were under the same crown.
And in Brazil, excursions called bandeiras flags, leaving from São Paulo, expanding the geographic territory.
The Bandeirantes or Paulistas expanded the national territory, opening paths through dense forests. And to this day, many important highways in Brazil are routes created by these groups,
formed by Europeans, natives and cowboys.
Many cowboys were hybrids that were not accepted by the indigenous people,
because they were descendants of Europeans.
And they were not accepted by Europeans because they were children of natives. So they participate in these excursions, serving as mediators of the two cultures. The cattle riders' entities originate in this context,
hence the generally pathfinder temperament.
In the 17th century, the first document reporting the practice of the Jurima religion was also written. That is, an aspect of Katim cult,
which is still practiced in northeastern Brazil and influences other later cults.
In Umbanda, the portal that is opened for calling entities is called Jurima. Jurima is a type of b.c.e. tree, whose bark is used to make a sacred drink, and it has native, Jewish, Arab, African, and popular Catholic influences.
In this time, gold is discovered in Minas Gerais,
which will move Brazil in the 18th century. Minas Gerais at this time had mostly African and indigenous inhabitants, and in this context, the Colundus cults emerge, a religion with dances, drums, oracles, and spiritual trance,
with communication with spirits.
In the 19th century, the temple of Casabranca de Engino Velho was founded in the city of Salvador,
which is the precursor of what would become Candomblé.
Brazil's independence also occurred in the 19th century. In 1822, this is thanks to the couple,
the Portuguese Prince Dom Pedro I,
and his wife, the Austrian Archduchess Dona Maria Leopoldina. She is the one who actually structured Brazil's independence.
Brazil is now called Empire of Brazil.
During this period, there was greater English and French influence, especially in fashion, hence some entities wear British attire. However, the Guardians in particular wear top hats, because during this period,
African kings had replaced their long, pointed crowns with top hats.
Georges Bonifacio, considered the patriarch of independence, was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. He brings to Brazil the Book of Spirits by Allan Kardec,
and here begins the religion called Kardec's Spiritism.
In the 19th century, the Yoruba Africans arrived, who profoundly influenced Brazilian religiosity.
To this day, with the cult of the Orishas.
It was also in this century that the formation of the secret cult of Capula occurred, which will profoundly influence the formation of Umbanda later. In addition, there was also Arab influence,
due to the Maoist revolt in 1835,
in which Muslim Africans fought for the freedom of Africans. When they were defeated, these Muslims were sent throughout Brazil, especially for Rio de Janeiro. The word Mandinga, which is a synonym for spell in Brazil, refers to these Muslims, and the Arabic magic that comes to deeply influence Brazilian rites. Macumba from Io also appears, which is the magical system that gave rise to the most current magical systems. In the northeast, enchantment cult had already been developed, and in the south of Brazil,
the Batuque Ku influenced by J.J. Yoruba was developed.
At the end of the 19th century, abolition occurred,
and also the arrival of several immigrants. During this period, Kardecist expansion also occurred along with the
proclamation of the Republic in 1889. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, books of European esotericism arrived, like Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine and the books of Eliphas Levi,
but also popular practices of the different people who arrived here between 1889 and 1930. During this period, Brazil receives 3.5 million foreigners. Among the main peoples are Italians, Germans, Japanese, Poles, Turks,
Egyptians, Syrians, Lebanese, and Palestinians. At the beginning of the 20th century,
candomblés were formed in Rio de Janeiro. Cardicism practices merged with macumba also in Rio de Janeiro. From this mixture arises what would be Umbanda,
which in practice already existed, but had no name. Since the Cardicists have a bourgeois majority, Umbanda gained status.
So the Macumba temples started calling themselves as Umbanda temples to protect themselves from police persecution. The esoteric center of the Communion of Thought also appears, whose books based on European esotericism, especially Eliphas L6.
My great-grandfather was even part of this group.
For an attempt at European interpretation of Brazilian magic. Inside some temples of Umbanda, priests used the manuals of this esoteric circle and applied them to the doctrine of Umbanda.
In the 1950s,
Umbanda was extremely popular and gained several branches.
This growing flow of influences developed several different
lines of work until the 1980s.
Some of the traditions that emerged were
Umbanda of ZLIO, strongly influenced by Catholicism and Cardicism. Umbanda of the White Table with Cardicist influence. Umbanda Miriam with terminology and a mixture of native practices. Umbanda of Nation, in which there is a mix with Candomblé. Umbanda Omolok with strong African influence. Esoteric Umbanda with a strong influence from European esotericism. Umbanda traced ancient cult of souls and Angola. Popular Umbanda more similar to Macumba and influenced by popular Catholicism. And Umbanda crossed with magic Umbanda and Quimbanda.
In the 60s, the Guardian King 7 in Cruzadas da Lira went to television incorporated into his medium, Casilda de Asses, and his presence makes many people incorporate their own guardians.
From a distance, just seeing him on land by the TV.
This led to greater resistance from the conservative
elite against the Umbanda religion.
From the 50s to the 80s,
the tradition of independent Quimbanda also was developed.
The cult of guardians that was not linked to the practices of Umbanda.
This movement occurs mainly by guardians who were spirits of African priests, who did not accept being converted to Catholicism, and they adopted practices to put fear into Europeans, so that they avoided punishment and persecution, using the fear of Europeans to their advantage. Some even ended up linking grimoire practices.
In this way, there are traditions that use a mixture of African worship,
indigenous worship, Arabic magic, Solomonic magic,
and the Grimorium Verum practices simultaneously,
while there are traditions that are born from resistance cults
and remain in just one of these aspects or a mixture of a few of them.
In the 1980s, with the growth of some Christian doctrines, African and native religions are considerably reduced.
Until the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s,
where doctrines such as sacred Umbanda, created by Rubin Saraceni, a more universalist approach begins to gain strength, along with Wicca and occultism, which grow exponentially in Brazil, following the arrival of films such as Young Witches in 1996 and Practical Magic in 1998, and the Harry Potter saga that began in 2001.
The revaluation of Umbanda occurred around 2006 to 2007, when its number of followers grew again.
The same occurs with Quimbanda, and in both various traditions and theologies emerge.
After 2010 to 2012, the flood of information on the internet creates countless cults. Various groups and temples are formed preaching the most diverse doctrines. Another point is that, due to an excess of disputes between temples, traditions and priests, priestly inconsistencies, excess of information, internal conflicts in temples, in addition to social and sometimes literal persecution from other groups.
What we see today in Brazil is a growing movement of free spirituality,
where each person determines the doctrine they will follow and what
and who they will work with. It is a common scenario in the occult and sorcery. However, it is unprecedented for practices that were traditionally passed on orally.
Most of the secrets are from word to ear. They are not in books.
And it takes an average of 7 years for a person to learn the basics to be able to work alone. If this process is not adapted in some way, a lot will be lost.
On the other hand, a lot has already been lost,
because some priests and sorcerers guarded their secrets so much that they died without teaching them.
So it is too early to say whether this is a path towards evolution or
extinction of oral traditions in Brazil,
since it has reasonable grounds for acceptance,
and criticizable at some points for not being so, simultaneously.
I hope you liked it.
Hail the King 7 Crossroads of the Lyra, and may my guardian, Mr. Marub, bless you all.